Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, this is Andrew Marty, Managing Director of SACS, and today we're going to be talking about the psychology of occupational health and safety behaviours. I'm going to be showing you some results from a project that we undertook into this topic of the psychology of OHS behaviours. And if you look at the objectives that we're really hoping to set today, firstly, we're asking the question, are some people intrinsically more safety conscious than others? In other words, in your recruitment practices, can you identify people who are more likely to be safe than others are in their workplace behaviours? Second, can we create a safety climate in our work groups? And we're going to be talking to you about some research into safety climate and what safety climate is and the impact that safety climate has on safety behaviours at work. So those are the two objectives for today. I'll say it again later on, but just to start off, if you want to get a copy of the presentation or the links, you will be sent the links from this presentation after it's been recorded, and so that will give you the opportunity to forward the links onto other people. We get lots of requests to do that, so feel free to do that. You will receive those. All right, so let's start off with the idea of safety climate. Now, safety climate is really the degree to which employees believe that the organisation is committed to safety. In other words, if an organisation has a high safety climate, people within that organisation believe that leaders emphasise safety. They believe that leaders encourage staff to work safely, to do the right things by way of colleagues, creating an organisation that is physically, psychologically, and in a well-being sense safe. Now, this is worth having because research shows you that this is a driver for real-world safety outcomes. So when you've got a safety climate as measurable through an instrument that measures safety climate, and we do that, by the way, for organisations, when you've got high safety climate, you will actually end up with less injuries. So safety climate, like many things, comes from two things. And one of them is the types of people that you let into the organisation, and the second is how you lead them once they're in. So safety climate's a really worthwhile thing to have in any organisation. So the second component of all of this is just the key determinants of safety behaviours. So safety behaviours really come from four different things. One is environmental factors. So safety behaviours in terms of environmental factors, well, environmental factors are things like, where are we? I mean, some workplaces are more dangerous than others. Dangerous physically, dangerous psychologically, safer physically, safer psychologically. There are environmental factors. Environmental factors also might be the cultural environment. So, for instance, if you go to workplaces where there has, in a geographical sense, not been much emphasis on safety, well, you're going to get a lower safety climate because that's kind of the environmental situation that workplace operates within. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is workplace policies, procedures, and practices. And so we know that if you develop good practices and good policies and good procedures and good training and all of that sort of stuff, you can make workplaces safer. This has been demonstrated both empirically and in the practical world on numerous occasions. Good policies and procedures and practices will improve things. Then you have the characteristic of human relationships. And so we'll be talking about this later in the presentation, that if you have people interacting effectively, if you have good relationships between people, if you have a style of leadership that emphasizes safety, that will help you to create a safety climate. So human relationships are important in creating safety behavior. And then there's personality. And so personality, we know that there are certain personality types that tend to be safer and certain personality types that tend to be less safe. And I'm going to show you some research where we look into personality and its ability to predict whether people are likely to act safely or unsafely. But as well as that, we'll be talking about safety, about values, and a person's value set can affect the levels of a person's safety behavior. So when you see personality, intrinsically there's more to it than just that. It can be a person's personality, but also their values may well affect the types of safety behaviors that we're like to see from them. And by the way, there's a list of references at the back of this. Sometimes people want to follow up and get some of the original sources of data and information for these research findings. You can do that. And so we've listed a few of the references at the bottom of that table. So if we're going to ask the question as to what works in terms of creating a safety behavior, a safety climate in an organisation. One of the things that we have to do is we have to look at what is it that causes people to behave, what is it that causes people to have high levels of engagement or well-being in any organisation. And in fact, there's a bunch of research from people like Mark Griffin and Peter Cotton and Harder and Schmidt, as you see at the bottom there. All these people have been involved in researching the effect of the environment that employees work within to see what affects their well-being, their productivity, their relationship with their colleagues. And in fact, what you see here is that employees, and Mark Griffin said, employees tend to live in four worlds. You've got three key worlds, which are my job, my team, and my organisation. But the fourth, in a sense, is my leader, because my leader affects the way my job sets up, and it also affects the way that the team relates to each other. So the point to understand here is that obviously my job has a big impact on my well-being, my attitude. If I'm doing work that I love, if I'm doing work that I care about, that matters enormously. My team, if I'm in a group of positive, collaborative, helpful colleagues, that's incredibly important. The third world is my organisation. And what I mean by that is that if you're in an organisation that's positive, energised, supportive, that's going to be better than being in an organisation that's negative, cynical, and disengaged. So the leader is a huge impact on the team and the job. And in fact, in a study that we undertook just recently, what we found was that the leader can be demonstrated through a mathematical technique called path analysis to create the corporate climate within the team, which affects people's perception of their job. And that has a massive impact on the employees' engagement. The engagement of individuals is determined very heavily by the team climate. So in a positive team, I'm more likely to be positive and to have high levels of well-being, and to care about my job more. So the leader is kind of like, as it's been said in the past, the leader is like the conductor of the orchestra, or you could say the chef that creates the psychosocial soup that any employee lives within, exists within. And good leadership creates a good environment, bad leadership creates a bad environment. But this bit over here is really crucial. What we're saying is that above the line, my team, my job, my leader, that seems to account for between 70 and 85% of employee engagement and well-being. Now, the organisation therefore accounts for only somewhere between, let's say, 20 and 15% of the employee's well-being. So that's a massive flexibility, a massive difference between those local factors and the organisational factors. My concern is that many organisational occupational health and safety initiatives are undertaken at the corporate level, and that's why some of them don't work very well, because corporate initiatives such as mission, vision, values tend to have little impact, and there's good, strong research evidence to demonstrate that corporate activities around the mission, vision, values space don't tend to change things very much, whereas local efforts, creating a local clarity, creating local activities seem to have a very big impact on the levels of well-being of employees, but as well as that, it seems to have a big impact on safety behaviours. So that's something that's really worth thinking about. Culturally, what you need is local cultural interventions rather than organisational cultural interventions. And actually, I think that occupational health and safety has historically been damaged by a focus on the organisational level interventions rather than the local level. But basically the way that works is that if I am an employee, the things that are closest to me have the biggest impact on me. The things that are furthest away from me have less impact. And what could be closer to me than the job that I'm doing in the team that I'm working with, reporting to my direct leader, rather than what does the executive team think about this? What does the chief executive think about this? That's what we call in psychology distal, whereas these things are proximal, proximal being close to me. So Annemette Björken in 2010 undertook a number of studies into safety in the offshore oil and gas industry in Scandinavia. And so, that's a kind of risky business, which is one of the reasons why it was an important piece of research. And she published her findings in the Journal of Risk Research. And what she concluded is that the work group level was absolutely crucial. And she commented as well that sometimes the work group level is neglected for a focus on the corporate level. And so this has a massive impact on people's subjective health status as well as accident frequency. And so what she suggested that OHS intervention should be targeted towards the work group level, in addition to the organisation as a whole. It's good to do stuff at the corporate level, but unless you do it group by group, your chances of improving safety are much reduced. And later on, I'm going to suggest a way of dealing with this at the local team level. So if we look at this, this is a big study that we did with Deakin University in 2017, forecasting the levels of engagement of individual staff, and the subject, the size of this survey was about 2,700 people or so. And we measured job factors, we measured team factors, we measured leader factors, and we measured organisation factors, just exactly as Mark Griffin had suggested we should. And what we discovered is that we found that if by measuring these job factors, these team factors, these leader factors, and these organisation factors, so things like at the job level, how optimistic am I about the future of the job? Am I getting variety? Do I feel confident? Those sorts of things. Team level, are we optimistic about the future of the team? Do we have freedom to make decisions? Do we get good performance feedback in my team? Are we committed to our customers? Things like at the leader level, the degree to which the leader is creating a learning environment or effectively managing negative behaviours, those sorts of things. Or at the organisation, how willing is the organisation to change? To what degree does the organisation encourage us to be free to make decisions? All of those things were able to predict the levels of engagement of individuals by 64%, which is a lot. I mean, that's one of the reasons why two first-tier publications have come from this research so far. 64 is a lot. So engagement driven by these things. But what's really interesting is if you look down here, these are the best predictors out of this gang of different 4 areas of characteristics that determine engagement. And what you'll see, J is for job. So these are job characteristics. You know, the top 4, you notice that they are all job characteristics. Then you have one L for leader characteristic, creates a learning environment. So that's a leader characteristic, and then team characteristics. And you'll notice that in the top, let's say up to about 8 things that determine a person's level of engagement. Well, you see there's not one organisational factor there. And in fact, these beta weights are really just a measure for the accuracy of prediction. And what it says is that learning at work is the number 1 driver of people's levels of engagement. Optimism is the number 2. Self-confidence is the number 3, and so forth down there. But these beta weights, you'll notice they get smaller as they go down. You have to go down a fair way before an organisational factor appears, and that's because local is more powerful than organisational. So I guess one way of describing this is if you're in a good team in a bad organisation, you're in heaven, and if you're in a bad team in a good organisation, you're in hell. So that's the kind of safety climate comparison. But what about individual differences? Can a person's personality and their value set predict their safety behaviours at work? Well, that's a really practical and straightforward and useful question to ask, I think, and it's certainly a good question to answer, because if the answer is yes, then it may well be that you can create a safer workplace purely and simply by your recruitment practices. So why don't we see what the results are? So in short, this was a study that we undertook a couple of years ago now. There's 2,049 people we got involved in this study. So that's a big study, big enough to form what in psychology we call a normative sample. Normative being that's big enough to draw conclusions that could be concluded to relate to employees generally, rather than if it's a very small sample, you really might say, well, it relates to a particular organisation, or it's just simply not big enough to draw conclusions from, but a normative sample. We're about half and half, males and females, so that's good. That's average age, about 43. Took about 50 minutes for people to complete the data that we needed to complete. And these were candidates on our employee database, people who'd applied for jobs or people who we'd psych tested. And we asked people a range of questions: personality, counterproductive work behaviours, these kinds of things. So one of the things that we measured in this study is we measured people's personality as assessed by a thing called the Hexaco Model of personality. Hexaco being for H for honesty, humility, E for extroversion, for emotionality, X for extroversion, Yes, I know X is slightly cheating, but it would have been the Hexaco model of personality if it hadn't have been X for extroversion, and that's nowhere near it as attractive. Then A for agreeableness, C for conscientiousness, O for openness to experience. And finally, you get this leftover, this interstitial scale called altruism, which really, that's not a seventh personality factor. It's a small thing. It's what we call a facet. So you see these things are factors, and these factors have 4 facets underneath them. And this is a facet. It's not an additional factor. It's a facet that didn't really fit into any of these. And in fact, it borrowed a little bit from each of these areas. So honesty, humility is the degree to which people are honest and truthful and straightforward and not arrogant. This is a very good predictor of bad behaviours, and it turns out to be an excellent predictor of things like bullying, harassment. It's also a good predictor of whether you are likely to go to jail. So if you score low in the honesty, humility factor of the Hexaco, you may well be more likely to go to jail than if you score high. Emotionality is the degree to which somebody is emotionally stable or emotionally unstable. And so when a person is low in emotionality, that means they are resilient. When they're high in emotionality, that means that they are somewhat emotional personally. Extroversion, well, everybody knows about extroversion. Extroverts are people-ish kind of people. They like people, they like to spend time with people, but also extroverts tend to be lively, which means optimistic, cheerful, chirpy, positive types. Agreeableness, this measure of agreeableness, for those of you who have ever used the 5-factor model of personality, as shown by something like the Costra-McCrae Neo, let's say, the agreeableness is a little different from that. What it means here is that high agreeableness means sort of approachable, flexible, easy to get along with. But in this model of agreeableness, low agreeableness means angry. And in particular, patience. Low patience means short fuse, getting angry quickly. Conscientiousness is the degree to which somebody is hardworking, committed, energetic, and also the sort of person who's kind of thoughtful. Prudence, for instance, is I am not impulsive. I do things thoughtfully. I don't do things impulsively. I do them after having planned them out, and I'm not reckless, basically. So that's an important thing for certain types of behavior. Finally, openness to experience. Openness to experience means I am broad-minded. I like doing new and different things. I'm interested in, inquisitiveness. I'm interested in information about the rest of the world. Creative. I want to do new and different things. Unconventionality. I'm sort of happy with people who are unusual in their attitudes or values or solutions. And so that's the 6 factors. Hexaco. And then you have this interstitial scale, altruism. And altruism is really the degree to which somebody's kind and helpful and maybe a little soft-hearted in dealing with other people. So that's personality. In addition to that, these 2,049 odd people, we measured their values. And we measured their values using the Schwartz Personal Values Questionnaire, otherwise known as the Portrait Values Questionnaire. And the Schwartz model suggests that there are 10 values which anybody in the world is going to have. These 10 values, Schwartz was building on the work of a gentleman by the name of Milton Rockedge, and he identified, and by the way, Schwartz has measured literally tens of millions of people on their values, measures about in excess of 5,000 each year through a thing called the European Social Survey. But the values that he measured he was able to discover were these 10. So power is the degree to which I want to dominate other people or resources. Achievement is the degree to which I am ambitious to improve my position in life, which is what makes it a self-enhancement kind of a characteristic. Hedonism means how important is it to me to have pleasurable and enjoyable experiences. Stimulation, the degree to which I believe it's important to do new and different things. Self-direction, the degree to which I want to run my own show versus the degree to which I don't value that. Universalism means I want to make the world a better place. So a person who's high on universalism is somebody who tends to be somebody who's interested in social justice or environmental sustainability or both. A universalistic person wants to make the world a better place. It's a sort of a conceptual thing, if you want to put it that way. Concern about the starving in Africa, inequality between men and women, that's the kind of thing that you'll get out of universalism. Benevolence, on the other hand, is not conceptual. Benevolence is I want to help this person right now. People who are highly benevolent are people who want to be kind to their colleagues or their family members. They're people who want to be relied on. They're people who like to do kind things for other people. Conformity is the degree to which somebody obeys rules, thinks rules are a good thing. And conformity at a glance might look like a bad thing, but in fact, conformity in general is a good thing. When you have a strong team spirit, when you psych test the people who are part of that strong team, you will typically find that they're high in conformity, because you actually can't have teamwork without a respect for the rules of the team. So that's what conformity provides you. Tradition is about being obedient to your society or to your culture or to your religion or whatever. So it's sort of like conformity taken to the next level of extremity. And finally, security is the degree to which I want to be safe, and I want to be secure, and I want the people I know about and like and care about also to be safe and secure. 10 values, 6 personality factors with 4 facets underneath them, plus 1 spare in altruism. So let me just talk a little bit about the difference between personality and values. Values are, in fact, quite heavily genetically determined, and one thing we know is that they tend not to change over the course of a person's life very much at all. So you can test somebody with the Hexaco, and you can test them again, let's say 6 months later, and you're going to get correlations of 0.7, 0.8 out of that. In other words, for practical purposes, that's about as close as you can get by measuring something twice. So accurate to say that people's personality doesn't change very much over the course of a person's life. And if you read research about the genetic determination of personality, some will say as low as 50%, some will say as high as 70%. I'm more at the 70% end of the spectrum myself, based on recent research. So very heavily genetically determined. On the other hand, values appear to be largely learned in the course of a person's life. So Jeremy Anglin from Deakin University and myself undertook a study last year where we measured people's values and personality. And what we found is that they correlated, but not massively heavily. And so about 30% of a person's value set appeared to be personality influenced, and it varied from value to value. But it would be fair to say that in a general sense, if personality is largely nature, values are largely nurture, if you want to put it that way. And we do know also that a person's values can change over the course of a person's life. So when a person has relocated from one culture to another, their personality is unlikely to change very much at all, but their value set could change quite markedly over the course of years as they assimilate into a new culture, because different cultures have different values. All right, so getting to the next part of this research setup, we asked people about 10 areas of counterproductive work behaviours. Now, this is from a piece of research going back into 2003 by 2 guys by the name of Grice and Sackett. What they did is they surveyed a whole bunch of organisations to ask them about the counterproductive work behaviours that they saw in their own workplace. Counterproductive work behaviours just means employees doing bad stuff. And so there are 10 here: lateness, not attending work when you're not too sick to do so, inability to get on with others, etc., etc., etc. But 7 is ignoring occupational health and safety policies and practices. So could we predict whether people were likely to ignore occupational health and safety policies and practices if we knew their personality and values? Interesting question, isn't it? And in fact, what we did in this study is that we did exactly that. We asked people in a confidential setting whether they ignored occupational health and safety practices. By the way, we asked them about a whole bunch of other bad stuff. And what you tend to find is that in confidential settings, when people say, yeah, I do this stuff, like let's say I bully people, I'm intentionally impolite to people, what you find is that you get much higher rates of confession to this than you would ever find in an organisation. I mean, the amount of this stuff that's actually discovered in organisations is incredibly small in comparison with people confessing to it in a survey where they know it has no consequences. So now, I have ignored or not followed safety or occupational health and safety rules at work. So this is the number 7, as we've got it headlined there. And what we discover is that about 21.4% of the professional population, this was a professional sample, about 21.4% of the professional population sometimes or more frequently ignores or doesn't follow occupational health and safety rules. So about a fifth of the population, what that means is about a fifth of the population can remember more than one recent event where they did this. So it would be fair to say that they're relatively regularly ignoring occupational health and safety rules. I also have had other employers say, well, the rarely is a problem for this. If somebody rarely does it, it means they're still doing it. So you can imagine in certain workplaces that could be pretty serious. But let's say about a fifth of the population is regularly ignoring safety rules. So that's quite a bit. So this diagram here is a diagram of a statistical technique called multiple regression. And multiple regression is really a technique where you measure a person's personality or values or whatever else is you're going to measure. In this case, we're measuring personality and values. And what you've got is you've got the 25 facets of the Hexaco personality inventory, and you've got 10 facets of the Schwartz personal values questionnaire. And then what we did is we measured overall occupational health and safety behaviours. How do we do this? We used an instrument from two gentlemen by the name of Mark Griffith and Andrew Neal, and they developed a measure of occupational health and safety behaviours. And they said that occupational health and safety behaviours are sort of a combination of being compliant, obedient. In other words, I'm going to fit in and do what people tell me to do. So if we've got rules about the fact that you've got to put your steel cap boots on. So one component is that obedience characteristic. The second is about being involved, being socially active. So you call this occupational health and safety participation, where I'm going to get involved with my colleagues and do this stuff. And the third is motivation. And so what that's really saying is, to what degree are you motivated to undertake occupational health and safety behaviours? So we use this internationally validated instrument to measure people's occupational health and safety behaviours, and we use the Hexaco to measure their personality, and we measured the Schwartz personal values questionnaire to measure their values. And the question really, in a mathematical sense, is, could you predict this from these? And the answer is emphatically yes. Not only did we get a very statistically significant regression out of this is the technique regression, but we found that we could measure nearly 40%, so 37 means 37%, we could measure nearly 40%, predict nearly 40% of a person's occupational health and safety behaviours from their personality and values. Well, that's kind of worth knowing, isn't it? That, 37%, I suppose you'd ask, what is 37%? Is that a big deal? Is it a little bit deal? Well, firstly, let's compare it with other recruitment methods. The accuracy of most interviews is about 12%. That's a long way from 37%. The accuracy of the absolutely best interviews ever constructed is about 25%. That's provided you're doing a competency analysis and writing very targeted behavioural interview questions. The accuracy of your average reference check is about 7%. So 37% in recruitment terms is pretty big. But I guess if you wanted to turn it from a discussion of the theoretical comparison of the accuracy of recruitment methods to something more practical, my question would be, if you could improve your occupational health and safety by 37%, would that be worth doing? I think many organisations would say yes. But let's look at the personality and values characteristics that predict occupational health and safety. The first is a thing called prudence. That's a conscientiousness personality characteristics. And what that means is a person who is prudent is somebody who's thoughtful. They're not impulsive. In effect, if you were talking about early childhood stuff, you would say self-regulation. You know how some kids are good at self-regulating, others aren't? People who are highly prudent are better at self-regulating. So that's a good thing if you want to create a safe workplace. The second highest is a value called security. And here we have security here. Security means I want to be safe. I want the people around me to be safe. I want to ensure that people don't run into the risk of harm. So the value of security. Now, remember that security is largely learned, whereas prudence is something that's kind of more likely to be hardwired, genetic. The third characteristic is a thing called fairness, and that's an honesty, humility characteristic. So fairness means the degree to which I am uncomfortable with cheating. A person who is very high in fairness is somebody who doesn't like to cheat, somebody who is an honest person, somebody who doesn't seek to take unfair advantage. That's interesting, isn't it, that that's a predictor of occupational health and safety behaviours. It does suggest that somebody who is fair-minded is the sort of person who undertakes their occupational health and safety efforts kind of almost as a social justice exercise because they're fair-minded. It's almost like cheating not to do a good job of this. You also see conscientiousness again, diligence. So conscientiousness is here, and diligence means I'm hardworking, I'm energetic, I try hard, that kind of thing. And finally, extroversion, social boldness. Turns out that this is a predictor of occupational health and safety behaviours. People who are socially bold tend to be more effective in collaborating with their colleagues. They tend to be more socially prominent in terms of trying to create a safe workplace. So that's a combination of the five best predictors of occupational health and safety from a personality and values point of view. Now, how can you use this? Well, in fact, out of this study, we created a mathematical model for people's psych results. And when a person is psyched using the Hexaco and the Schwartz Portrait Values Questionnaire, what we're doing is we're creating you can choose to avail yourself of this. We create a model of occupational health and safety risk. So if a person has all these favourable characteristics, it's going to say that they're likely to be a good occupational health and safety risk. If they don't have them, or if they have negative personality and values characteristics, then the mathematical model will suggest that maybe there's a little bit more cause for cautiousness. So in short, the intrinsic internal makeup of a person does have an impact on how likely they are to undertake safety activities. Now, something else we did in this study is that we looked at the characteristic. This is from the SACS measure of counterproductive work behaviours. We looked at this counterproductive work behaviour. I have ignored or not followed safety or occupational health and safety rules at work. And what we wanted to ask is that, as you can see, there are 9 other counterproductive work behaviours here: being late, not being taking a sick day even though you're not really sick, leaving jobs because you can't get on with people, distractions, being impolite to others, theft, being critical of your own organisation, ignoring or getting around other policies at work which I didn't respect, and if I don't like someone at work, I ignored them or snubbed them. So one is the incivility one is the one about being critical of organisations, or I've found it necessary to be impolite to other people at work. This is not being actively impolite. This is being passively impolite. In other words, snubbing or ignoring people. No minor matter, by the way, because as we know, bullying by exclusion is a very serious point of bullying. But the question we wanted to ask is, could you predict this bad behaviour from these other bad behaviours? And the answer is, yeah, you could, with about coming close to 30% accuracy. So what that means is that when people do some bad things, they're likely to do other bad things. But what we found was the 2 best predictors of doing bad things in respect of occupational health and safety. One was simply, I don't respect policies. So that's this one here. And I guess it's probably not surprising that people who don't like policies generally also don't like occupational health and safety policies. I guess it would be kind of strange if people liked occupational health and safety policies despite hating all of the rest of the policies that an organisation has. But the second one is very interesting, because what it says is, I've taken company property, and that's a good predictor of whether people are likely to ignore the occupational health and safety rules. Now, why is it so? And the answer is, I really don't know. I've discussed this with many psychologists. People are fascinated by this. We will sooner or later undertake another couple of studies to try and understand the link between theft and occupational health and safety. I mean, many people have said, well, it's just a disrespect for the rules. But in fact, that's possible. But I think all of these are to do with disrespect for the rules. So I have no idea why this theft thing comes out, especially with such a big beta weight, 0.23, 0.27. What that means is that of the rest of the beta weights, they were quite small in comparison. So now, the other thing I will say is that when I've shown these results to people who are in really occupational health and safety critical organisations, what they say is that they've noticed that when occupational health and safety lapses, they get more theft. So there is definitely an effect here, and I'm not quite sure exactly what's going on, but that is a fascinating finding for another time. So, if you notice stuff being pinched around the organisation, maybe you need to be a little conscious of the fact that maybe the organisation's not quite as safe as it used to be, or it might be trending that way. All right, now I like to go straight for the controversial stuff. So this was a fascinating one. What we're really doing is we're measuring the occupational health and safety compliance of the of males versus females, and we're asking who is safer, males or females. So this is a counterproductive work behaviour. I have ignored or not followed safety or occupational health and safety rules. And what you find is that this was statistically significantly different. And so the females, pink for girls and blue for boys, good old traditional way of differentiating. And what we found was that men are significantly more likely to ignore occupational health and safety rules than women are. So that's an interesting finding in itself. So if you have a workplace, and remember we were talking about 1,120 men and 929 females, so either of those samples are big enough to be considered to be normative. So, that's a large group. And what it's saying is that men are a bit less safe than women. I don't know whether that's news to you or whatever, but that's what we found in this study. Now, what we also did, and this is sort of getting a little bit complicated and subtle, but I'll keep it as simple as I possibly can. What we did is we undertook a regression, one of those predictive models. We wanted to predict occupational health and safety disobedience, if you want to put it that way, for men and for women. And what we discovered is that we could predict men's occupational health and safety disobedience with about 21% accuracy. For women, it was about 27% accuracy. So women's results were a little bit more predictable than men's. Not massively different, but you're talking about another sort of 5-6 percentage points of variance accurately encompassed. But what is interesting is that if we looked at the personality and values characteristics that drove these things, you'll see that the reasons for ignoring safety, are actually quite different between men and women. And so what we see is that when men are unsafe, it's really low fairness that tends to cause it. Remember I said that fairness was a good predictor overall? So that's the single biggest predictor. Low prudence. So what that means is I don't think about what I'm about to do. I'm impulsive. And organisation is also a good predictor. So what it means is that if you take this overall, men, when they're unsafe at work, it's because they don't care about cheating, they're not very thoughtful, and they're disorganised, if you want to put it that way. However, when women are unsafe at work, so again, we've got a slightly better prediction, about 26, 27%, but the top predictors, the main predictors out of personality and values were different. So prudence, okay, so that's pretty much the same. Fairness, that's pretty much the same. And then the emotionality characteristic of fearfulness. So low fearfulness means high ignoring of safety rules. Whereas you see fearfulness doesn't come into this at all. So what that means is that people, men, when they're acting unsafely, well, maybe they just feel more reckless to do it, rather than being all that concerned about the fearfulness thing. In other words, the fearfulness factor, for women, being concerned about the consequences seems to be a good driver of safety, whereas men don't seem to have that. Flexibility. When people are low in flexibility, what that means is that they are likely to ignore the safety rules. I guess that what that might mean is that, okay, flexibility means it must be done my way. And maybe that I want things done my way says, well, I'm not going to obey a safety rule because that's not my way. You see, patience. When patience is high, which means that I tend not to get angry. So it's maybe like an over-tolerance factor. That seems to be a contributor to ignoring safety rules. And so does social self-esteem. So maybe people who are less confident in a social sense, women who are less confident, tend to be more likely to ignore safety rules. And finally, what you've got here is organisation. And an organisation, when an organisation is low, and so that's virtually exactly the same result for men. So when organisation is low, in other words, I'm disorganised, I will act unsafely. So I guess what you could say is that you could say with this fearfulness, flexibility, patience, social self-esteem, it's sort of more of a concern factor for well-being than is the case here. With men, it seems more like an obedience, commitment, impulsiveness, non-cheating kind of a characteristic. Here for women, it seems to be a little bit more about the degree to which I'm going to care about people almost at a human level. So interesting to see the drivers. One of the things that I showed this to a mining company once, and they, in fact, use different messages for men and women. It's very interesting, isn't it? If you think that there are such different drivers for safety behaviours for men and women, if there are different drivers, then different messages are going to work. So what you emphasise in your occupational health and safety communication, should you use the same thing for both men and women? Well, yeah, prudence works, fairness works, organisation works. But for women, maybe it's more of if you want the message to really have bite, it's maybe a little bit more like, hey, just make sure that you're not damaged. Make sure your colleagues are not damaged. I mean, men maybe because of this kind of macho testosterone thing think, oh, well, I won't be damaged anyway. That message would seem, because of the fearfulness component, would seem to be a more powerful message there. And the flexibility, fit in with your colleagues, more almost like a mutual caring kind of a message might work well for women, which perhaps doesn't work quite so well for men. Now, ignoring occupational health and safety practices, we split up age groups, and basically, I guess what you see at a glance is that from 30 years and younger, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, 51 years and older, people get safer as they get older. And being on the wrong side of 50 myself, one thing I can tell you is everything hurts more as you get older. So maybe that's part of it. But it's also, we find that people become kind of more concerned about well-being generally, more concerned about, I don't know, the rules, if you like. And perhaps not surprisingly, both in men and women, the younger is the more safety orientated. This, by the way, is really important because one of the things that we know is that older people do get injured more at work. So it's good that they're more safety conscious, because if they were as reckless as they were at 30, then, in a lot of workplaces, you do see that more elderly people get injured more often. If they were as reckless as they were in their youth, then it may well be that you're going to see even worse injury rates. So that's sort of personal characteristics. And I guess what we're saying is that you should psych test on the way in to identify which employees are likely to be more safe than others. And if you are able to identify this, this could improve your safety at work by virtue of your recruitment practices. But then there's a leadership question. So let's talk about some characteristics of how to lead for safety. Now, ultimately, there are three types of leadership. This isn't quite right. It's not really three types. This is a continuum. And at one end of the spectrum, you have the top-down thing. You will do X, Y, Z. I will tell you what to do. So this is a boss talking to an employee. You must do X, Y, Z. Then you have consultation, which is where I go out and I ask people, Mary, what do you think? John, what do you think? Bill, what do you think? Jane, what do you think? Helen, what do you think? And then I'll go back to my office and I'll make my decision. That's a consultative way of making a decision. The third way of deciding things is to do it through facilitation. And that's where a leader sees themselves not as a boss or as a consultant, but as a facilitator of a process. And facilitative leadership is where the leader gets all of the employees in one room. And you see, we've got 5 employees here. I've done this with up to 250 people at the one time. A facilitative leadership process is where the leader does not bring content. The leader doesn't come into the room saying, hey, I know what we're going to do, and you have to do X or Y or Z. Or just says, well, what does everybody else think? Because I'm going to decide myself. A facilitative leader facilitates a process, doesn't bring content, but brings a process, leads people through a decision-making process where then they decide what they're going to do. And the way that the decision is usually made in a facilitation process is where this person would go on the votes of these people about what needs to be done. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, the reason I'm telling you all of this is that these 3 different models of leadership can be shown to have a big impact on the levels of engagement of staff. And what we also know is that most leaders are kind of comfortable in one of these 3 models of leadership. Some are really top-down, some are really consultants. I would have to say not that many are facilitators where they're going to say, okay, group, what do you think needs to be done? Let's take a vote and then I'll back you to do it. That's a rare type of leadership. It is done, but it's relatively more rare than the first 2. But what we're really saying here is that a good leader should be able to do all 3 of these. And in fact, optimally, a good leader should be able to transit from knowing when it's the right thing to do the top-down thing, knowing when it's right to do a facilitation, knowing when it's right to consult people and then to decide based on what they have to say. 3 styles of leadership. Now, this style of leadership, where a leader facilitates a process where the staff make the decision, we know that that is the most powerful way of increasing levels of engagement within any workforce. We know that engagement is heavily driven by empowerment. It's heavily driven by the fact that people learn at work. It's heavily driven by a sense of optimism. And of course, this style of leadership, you will come up with the solution, can be very powerful to drive those kinds of outcomes. So that's facilitative leadership. Now, how do you do this? Well, I'm going to suggest that one of the things that you would do if you're trying to improve occupational health and safety in an organization, or let's say in a work group, is that what you really want to do is that you want to make sure that we've got a representative sample of people from that work group in a room. I mean, if it's 20 people, the ideal, of course, is just to have all 20 in the room at the one time. No problem. That's the best way to do it. But if you're talking about 1,000 people, what you're going to have to do is get some kind of a subset, create what people call an occupational health and safety committee or something like that. The point that I want to make about that, though, is if you do this, you really want to make sure as much as possible, without sort of overly engineering this, that you've got different levels of seniority, you've got different geographical locations. But what I'm going to suggest is it's a really bad idea, in this case, to use volunteers. Now, why do I say that? Volunteers are of their very nature unrepresentative of their colleagues. Volunteers tend to be either people who have an axe to grind, or they tend to be people who are strongly yay-sayers or strongly naysayers. But for whatever reason, they tend not to be representative of their colleagues. So we strongly recommend a nomination process or an election process by colleagues. And the other thing that we recommend is that you should use groups which are as large as possible. People always think that this stuff is done better by a small group. No, it's better to have the army with you than against you. So I have been involved in many projects, such as restructuring organizations, where we used representatives, change champions, staff advisory groups, whatever you wanted to call them. And out of 450 people, I like to see 150 of those involved. Now, if you do that and you facilitate it well, you can bring about very significant improvements. These little arrows spiking out in all different directions is to really say, if a person's from this level, they make contact with 4, 5, 6, 3, a whole bunch of their colleagues. So the influence is way beyond the group of these employees, especially because you remember I was going back, if you go back earlier, I was talking about the proximal distal thing. These people are proximal to all of the people in their areas. And so if you've got an undertaking to improve safety and everybody knows somebody who's on it, that's going to be way more powerful than sitting there thinking, well, I wonder who this initiative is being run by. Who are these people? So, all right, we're going to talk about a specific technique for facilitative leadership for safety. So it could be done at the individual level, which is an individual coaching process, which is I am talking to you, Mary Smith, and I need you to improve your safety behaviours. Or it could be at the group level, group facilitation, where we're going to say, okay, group, let's define safety and let's find a good way of tackling this. So the first thing that we're going to do, and this technique we call a drop technique of facilitative leadership: destination, reality checking, option creation, and planning, doing, and reflecting. So the first thing that we're going to do to create high levels of occupational health and safety is that we're going to develop a positive outcome focus. So the human brain's drawn towards positive destination. And so what we mean by that is that I think that, you, like I, have driven through factory gates and you see 240 hours lost time injuries. So avoiding lost time injuries is not a very optimum way of setting these processes up from an occupational health and safety point of view. From what we know about the understanding brain, about our understanding of the human brain, is that the human brain is drawn towards a positive destination. So it's like you can say, look, I want to lose 2 kilograms, or you can say, I have a target weight, which is 84 kilograms. It seems that 84 kilograms is more attractive to people than I want to lose 2 kilograms. Now, I think the negative focus in occupational health and safety tends to be about avoiding ill. And of course, we want to do that, obviously. what recent research says is that rather than focusing on a negative outcome, let's focus on a positive outcome. So let's define well-being. So rather than saying, look, absence of injury is good occupational health and safety, which I think is a rather gloomy medical model way of looking at occupational health and safety, why don't we define well-being? And so what you would do is that you would go through a facilitative leadership exercise where you would get your group you'd facilitate them to come up with a definition of optimum well-being in their workplace. And optimum well-being might, it's going to be interesting to see what they come up with. They might come up with psychological things like being happy and healthy. They might come up with physical things, so things like being strong and flexible and energetic or whatever. But creating a destination, and a destination, by the way, should be a relatively simple statement of, let's say, up to about 7 things that we're going to try and move towards. Now, of course, in setting this positive destination, it's either going to state or it's going to strongly imply that you can't be healthy without minimizing injuries. The important thing about this is that this creates a sort of a spirit of enthusiasm. I have sat in, as I'm sure you have, in a lot of occupational health and safety sessions, and the avoidance of something tends to be very ineffective. The other thing, I think, going back to this idea of doing this as a facilitative leadership exercise, it's amazing how often we see occupational health and safety done as a top-down exercise. I've been to mine sites, and you get a whole bunch of blokes, usually blokes, sitting around in their blue T-shirts with their steel cap boots on, hanging up their high-vis vests on the peg outside, and they'll sit there for an hour while people talk to them about occupational health and safety. That's Model 1 leadership. Model 1 does not change people anywhere near as effectively as Model 3, and Model 3 also enthuses people to change. It creates high levels of engagement. So once we've set our destination, you should do a reality check. And the reality check is really to say, well, how close are we to this destination? I normally do it with numbers, where 10 means we're perfect, nothing needs to change. 0 means we're as bad as we could possibly be, and 5 means we're neither good nor bad. When you average their numbers, let's say it comes out as a 4, well, we know that we've got some changes to make. I would also, in the reality checking part, once I've got an average score for people's current situation, I would get them to say, this is where we want to be in 6 months' time, to set a target. So you can imagine if we're a 4 now and we want to be a 7 in 6 months' time, well, getting from 4 to 7, that's quite a significant change. And if you get those numbers, people who create the numbers in front of you, firstly, it's their numbers, like the destination is their destination. You're not imposing anything on them. Those numbers tell them, they'll draw their own conclusion about the fact that we've got some work to do. Option creation. Option creation is about getting the group. Imagine you've got 20 people. What I would do is that I would split them into groups of 3, let's say, hand them a flip chart and a pen and say, come up with as many clever ideas as you possibly can for making a safer workplace. Now, this is a brainstorming exercise. So they're going to write all of this stuff down in their groups, and then you're going to stick them up on the wall, and everybody's going to show each other what they created, and then I would vote for them. And I'd vote for them, 3-2-1, like Brownlow medal style, as we call it here in Victoria in the football. Actually, not only in Victoria these days for football, but what it means, 3 votes for the best solution, 2 votes for the second best solution, 1 vote for the third best solution. Everybody writes down their votes, you count them up, and the ones that get a lot of votes, you then adopt those as initiatives to improve the workplace from an occupational health and safety or from a well-being point of view. And what you then also do is that rather than simply leadership saying, all right, well, we now own this, I think what you've got to do is you've got to cause people to get involved in doing it. People will actually, the staff need to lead this stuff. The leaders can fund it, can support it, can engender it, but if it's actually being done by staff members, it's going to be way more powerful than if staff are really delegating this to their upwards to their bosses. Because one of the things that we know is that people do not learn by sitting, people learn by doing. Now, this is way more psychologically rewarding than something like reducing injury rates. So it's a much more powerful way of changing things. Now, I'd be suggesting do this at the work group level. So you might have, if you've got 20 work groups, you might have 20 different plans. That's what's going to work. That's what Annemette Björken showed in her Scandinavian oil rigs and offshore gas facilities. Doing it at the local level is way more powerful than doing it at the organisational level. doing it group by group and having each one having their own plan where they actually do it causes them to be much more effective and active. So the 2 lessons are recruit for safety, and we can help you with that. If you want to find out how to do that, just drop us a line and we'll explain exactly what occupational health and safety measurement is about at a psych testing level. And the second is to lead for it. Lead as a facilitator, and this is a term that I've invented for facilitative leadership, unbossing. I think the leaders of the future, they're going to have to be boss-like some of the time, but the most effective leaders are, in fact, unbossing. They tend not to be bosses. They tend to be facilitators who cause the staff to be able to create their own workplaces. Now, one of the things that's another benefit of this is, of course, if you do this, if you lead like a facilitator, what that does is it sponsors an environment where the staff then become much more able to solve their own problems. So rather than coming to you to solve their problems, to rescue them, to lead them out of the wilderness, they develop the capability, they develop the competence and confidence to do it themselves. And that, I think, is a way of achieving a safer work climate. Just to remind you, you will get a copy of a link, so forward this to colleagues if you feel that it's helpful to them. If you want a copy of the notes, don't hesitate to let us know. We're only too happy to give you a copy of the presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and may the rest of your day be entirely safe.